"You don't belong here, and you never will." The words cut through the morning air sharper than any knife, loud enough for the whole market to hear, harsh enough to draw smirks and sidelong glances from the crowd gathering like vultures. He stood there silent, as if the hate sliding off their tongues was nothing new, as if humiliation was a language he had long since learned to endure. They ripped down his stand before a single crate could be placed, spat lies about his work without ever touching a single fruit, treated his skin like a crime for which no apology could ever be enough. No one cared to ask who he really was, what he had built, what history walked beside him that morning. They thought they were crushing a nameless, powerless man. They had no idea the storm they had just unleashed, a storm that would tear apart everything they thought was safe, clean, and controlled. Stay with me, because this story does not end the way they planned. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, take a second to like this video, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and where in the world you are watching from. Your voice matters here. Calvin Brooks arrived at the bustling farmers market just as the morning sun warmed the dew-soaked fields around Milltown. His truck, a battered but reliable old Ford, rumbled into the dirt parking lot, drawing a few sidelong glances from vendors already setting up their colorful displays of produce, handmade goods, and artisanal treats. Calvin was used to the stares. He had grown up with them, worn them like an uncomfortable coat he could never quite take off. Today, however, he came with hope. His farm had produced a harvest finer than any in recent years. Fresh heirloom tomatoes, golden squash, and sweet peppers that glistened like jewels. He moved carefully, unloading crate after crate, arranging them with a quiet pride that spoke of decades of hard work and respect for the land. As he placed a final sign, "Reading fresh from Brooks Farm," he noticed a group of nearby vendors gathering, murmuring among themselves. A heavy-set man with a red baseball cap spat into the dust and stalked toward him, flanked by two others whose expressions ranged from mocking amusement to open hostility. Calvin nodded politely, wiping his hands on his jeans, but they offered no greeting in return. Instead, the leader sneered and gestured broadly at Calvin's setup, as if it were an eyesore polluting the landscape. The words they spoke were loud enough for the nearby shoppers to hear, though their language was cloaked in the thin veneer of false politeness that barely disguised the contempt beneath. Calvin's stomach tightened, but he remained calm. He reached for the laminated certificate hanging by the stand, proof of his license to sell at the market, same as any other vendor, but the man slapped it from his hands with a casual backhand that sent it fluttering to the ground. A small crowd was beginning to form now. Shoppers, other vendors, and children licking cones of homemade ice cream all watched in a mixture of curiosity and silent judgment. Calvin bent to pick up the paper, smoothing it with care, then turned toward the main office to find someone in charge. Before he could take a step, a woman in a pressed blue shirt and sensible shoes intercepted him. Sandra Myers, the market manager. Calvin had seen her picture on the town's website, smiling broadly under a banner promoting community, tradition, and excellence. Today, she wore no smile. She glanced briefly at the scene, the toppled crates, the sneering vendors, the scattered vegetables, and then fixed her eyes coldly on Calvin. Without a word, she jerked her head toward two teenage employees. The boys moved quickly, dismantling Calvin's stall as if it were a minor inconvenience, rather than the culmination of weeks of backbreaking labor. Calvin opened his mouth to protest, but Sandra held up a hand, silencing him as effectively as a courtroom gavel. She spoke in measured tones, her words heavy with finality. She said the market had the right to refuse service, that they had no room for troublemakers, that she was maintaining order. Calvin stood frozen, feeling the familiar burn of helplessness rise in his chest. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence. A few vendors smirked, others turned away, pretending to rearrange their displays. No one spoke for him. No one questioned what they were seeing. Instead, he set about preparing for the next market day, meticulously cleaning his crates, inspecting every vegetable, polishing each fruit until it gleamed with pride. Early the next Saturday, he returned to the same market, his shoulders squared, his spirit intact. The morning mist clung low to the ground as he pulled into his usual spot, heart pounding but hand steady. This time he was ready. Calvin had brought not only his license to vend, but also all the necessary documentation, stamped and sealed by the county office. He laid out his produce in careful rows, every item flawless, every sign perfectly aligned. He stood tall beside his booth as the first customers wandered past, some offering polite nods, others shooting wary glances. It did not take long for the same group from the previous week to notice him. Rick Donovan, a man with a thick mustache and a gut that strained against his suspenders, swaggered over, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Behind him trailed the same two cronies, chuckling under their breath. Rick stopped in front of Calvin's stand, scanning the produce with an exaggerated sneer. Calvin greeted him evenly, pulling out his vendor license and extending it toward Rick without a word. Rick snatched the paper from Calvin's hand, crumpling it roughly before waving over a nearby security guard. "This man doesn't belong here," Rick said loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "Selling questionable goods without proper certification." Calvin tried to interject, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, my paperwork is official. You can verify it with the county office." But the security guard, a young man barely out of high school, hardly glanced at the license before grabbing it, tearing it down the middle, and tossing the pieces into a nearby trash bin. The crowd around them grew, whispers buzzing like flies. Calvin could feel eyes on him, some curious, others suspicious. Rick leaned in closer, his voice a mocking whisper meant to sound friendly, but dripping with venom. "Nobody wants your dirty produce, old man," he said. Then, louder, for the crowd, "You people never play by the rules." Calvin's jaw clenched, but he stayed rooted to the ground, refusing to react. A woman nearby, clutching a small child's hand, steered clear of Calvin's booth as if afraid of contamination. Another vendor across the lane crossed his arms and shook his head. Someone muttered, "Should have stayed where he came from." Rick turned back to the crowd and barked, "You see this? Unsanitary. Unsafe. Who knows what's been sprayed on these vegetables?" He kicked a crate slightly, causing a few tomatoes to roll onto the ground. The security guard did nothing to stop him. Calvin bent down slowly, picking up each fallen tomato with deliberate care, his hands steady despite the rising storm inside him. He placed them back into their crate, brushing the dust away as best he could. "Please," Calvin said, directing his voice to the security guard rather than Rick, "I have every right to be here. I followed every regulation. I have nothing to hide." But the guard shifted uncomfortably and said, "We've been instructed not to allow disturbances." Calvin straightened up, fixing the young man with a gaze steady and full of something ancient and unyielding. "The only disturbance," Calvin said quietly, "is your fear of letting me stand here." Rick laughed, slapping the guard on the shoulder as if congratulating him. "Good man. Keeping things orderly," Rick said, smirking as he turned back toward his booth. The crowd slowly dispersed, most of them unwilling to meet Calvin's eyes. Sandra Myers stood at a distance, arms folded, a small satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. No words were exchanged, but her posture said everything. She would not intervene, and she would not allow Calvin to win. Calvin remained at his booth for another 2 hours, even though hardly anyone approached. A few curious souls lingered at the edges, but ultimately chose to move along, cowed by the tension still lingering in the air like smoke after fire. When it became clear that he would not be allowed to conduct fair business, Calvin quietly packed up his produce, loading each crate back into his truck with the same care and dignity he had shown when setting up. As he slid behind the wheel, he looked back at the market once more. The morning fog was thick when he arrived at the market again. The same faces were there, the same sneers curling in the corners of their mouths, but Calvin ignored them all. He focused on his booth, setting it up methodically, laying out the produce with the precision of an artist arranging a gallery. For a short moment, it seemed as if he might be left alone, as if the previous days of humiliation might finally be behind him. Then he saw her approach, a woman he recognized from the market staff, Bethany Cross. She was young, probably no more than 25, with a clipboard clutched in one hand and a scowl already forming on her face. Without a greeting, she stalked toward Calvin's booth, eyeing his setup with disdain. Calvin remained calm, welcoming her presence as another test to endure. "Sir, we've had complaints," Bethany said sharply, her voice slicing through the morning stillness. Calvin asked politely, "Complaints about what?" Bethany waved her hand vaguely over the produce, as if the sight alone were offense enough. "Quality concerns, hygiene concerns, disturbances." Calvin replied evenly, "Everything here is fresh, inspected, and properly licensed. If you would like, I can show you the paperwork again." But Bethany seemed uninterested. She moved closer, towering over Calvin's modest display. "We need you to leave," she said, louder this time, making sure nearby shoppers heard. Calvin stood firm, refusing to be intimidated. "I have followed every rule," he said. "You have no grounds to remove me." A few heads turned in their direction. Mothers holding bags of fresh corn, elderly couples sipping coffee from paper cups, teenagers texting by the picnic tables. Bethany's face flushed with frustration. She reached forward, grabbed the edge of Calvin's table, and gave it a rough shove. The crates wobbled dangerously. Calvin instinctively moved to stabilize them, but Bethany seized the moment. With a sharp push against his shoulder, she sent Calvin sprawling backward. He landed hard against the gravel path, a sharp pain shooting up his arm as he caught himself from a worse fall. A gasp rippled through the crowd, but no one moved to help him. Calvin pushed himself up slowly, brushing dust from his clothes, his dignity battered but intact. "You assaulted me," Calvin said, his voice low but clear. Bethany scoffed. "You were being aggressive," she said, turning to the onlookers. "He was threatening me." Murmurs started. Whispers carried on the breeze. Calvin opened his mouth to protest, but he saw the cell phones pointed in his direction, not to document the truth, but to capture the spectacle. Someone across the market, hidden behind a booth of baked goods, was filming. Calvin knew instinctively how that video would be edited. Hours later, his fears became reality. A video clip surfaced online, trimmed and altered to show only Calvin stepping forward, the moment right before Bethany shoved him, making it seem as if he had lunged at her. The caption read, "Aggressive vendor causes disturbance at Milltown Market." Comments flooded in within minutes. People he had never met called him dangerous, a troublemaker, a threat to public safety. Some demanded he be banned permanently. Others suggested worse. Calvin watched the video once, twice, each time feeling the sting of betrayal deepen. No mention of his torn license, no mention of Rick Donovan's harassment, no mention of Bethany's aggression. Just a narrative perfectly crafted to reinforce the assumptions they already wanted to believe. His phone buzzed with calls he did not answer. The friends from neighboring towns reached out hesitantly, their voices wary, their words careful. "Maybe you should let it go," one said. "It's not worth the trouble," another warned. Calvin listened, but did not agree. Injustice, once seen, could not be unseen. His father had taught him that long ago. His truck creaked into the same dusty parking lot where everything had begun, and he moved with quiet dignity as he unloaded his crates and set up his stand once again. At first, the morning passed with little more than sidelong glances. No customers approached his booth. Mothers pulled their children closer as they walked by. Elderly couples who once chatted with him now turned their heads away as if he were invisible. Calvin kept arranging his produce, his hands steady, his back straight, refusing to let the isolation bend him. Vendors he had known for years, men and women he had shared coffee and friendly words with in better days, now crossed the path to avoid him. When Calvin tried to greet a neighboring vendor, a middle-aged man selling jars of honey, the man stiffened and looked away, pretending not to hear. Calvin understood. Fear was contagious. No one wanted to be seen associating with the man who had been labeled dangerous. He saw it in their faces, the calculation, the self-preservation. He bore it all in silence. Around midday, a group of teenage boys loitered near the edge of the market. Calvin noticed them immediately. They were not carrying shopping bags. They were not interested in produce or baked goods. They watched him with mocking grins, elbows nudging each other, laughter suppressed, but barely. Calvin stayed alert, pretending not to notice. He continued stacking his tomatoes carefully, counting each one, humming low under his breath. Without warning, the first egg splattered against the side of his truck, yellow yolk sliding slowly down the sun-bleached ore. Another followed, then another. Shoppers nearby gasped, but did not intervene. Calvin heard one of the boys laugh and shout, "Get out of here, troublemaker." Another jeered, "Go back to where you belong." Calvin turned, locking eyes with the boys. He said nothing. His silence was heavier than any shouted curse. The boys, emboldened by the lack of response from the crowd, pelted several more eggs at his truck before running off, their laughter echoing through the rows of booths. Calvin wiped his hands on his jeans, retrieved a bucket of water from his supplies, and began cleaning the mess in slow, measured movements. Shoppers walked by, pretending not to see, their conversations growing louder to cover the uncomfortable reality unfolding beside them. A few watched with guilty expressions, but quickly turned away when Calvin's eyes met theirs. Calvin did not let his hands tremble. He scrubbed until the truck's door gleamed again, until the last trace of humiliation had been washed away. He knew that the real stain was not on his truck. It was in the hearts of those who stood by and did nothing. When the sun began to sink low on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the market, Calvin packed up his booth once again. He had sold almost nothing. Only a single elderly woman, after hesitating for long minutes, had purchased a small basket of strawberries and whispered, "I'm sorry," before scurrying away. As he loaded the last crate, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw Rick Donovan leaning casually against a nearby post, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing across his lips. Rick tipped an imaginary hat and said, "Tough day, huh, farmer?" Calvin said nothing. He secured the last crate and closed the tailgate with a firm snap. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he saw Sandra Myers standing at the far end of the lot, speaking with a group of other vendors. She did not look at him, but Calvin knew she saw him. Everyone saw him. They just chose to pretend otherwise. Calvin drove home under the gathering dusk, the country roads blurring past his windows. He felt tired, more tired than he had in years, but the exhaustion did not reach the core of him. That place remained untouched, fortified by something deeper than anger. It was justice he sought, not vengeance. It was dignity he protected, not pride. At home, Calvin unloaded the unsold produce, setting it aside for donation to a local shelter. He sat on his porch as night fully descended, the stars emerging one by one. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out, its voice lonely but strong. One of them, a tall man with a clipboard and a clipped mustache, stepped forward and blocked Calvin's path. "You need to leave," the man said in a voice devoid of emotion. Calvin frowned slightly and asked, "Under what grounds?" The man flipped through a few papers on his clipboard before producing a letter stamped with a Milltown Farmers Market seal. It stated in formal bureaucratic language that Calvin Brooks was permanently banned from all market activities effective immediately due to repeated disturbances and safety concerns. Calvin took the letter, reading it carefully, feeling a slow burn of disbelief rise in his chest. "I have never caused a disturbance," Calvin said quietly, his voice steady. "I have only tried to sell produce with honesty and dignity." The man shrugged, not meeting his eyes, and said, "The decision has been made." Calvin looked past him at the rows of tents and booths bustling with activity, at the vendors who had so easily turned their backs on him, at the customers wandering from stand to stand with their baskets full of fresh goods. This market had once promised him a chance to build something lasting, to connect with the community he called home. Now, it had shut its doors without even offering him the courtesy of a hearing. "I would like to appeal the decision," Calvin said, folding the letter neatly and tucking it into his jacket pocket. The second man, shorter and rounder, snorted under his breath and said, "There is no appeal." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Surely there is a process," he said. "Every organization has a grievance procedure." The tall man shook his head. "Not for you," he said simply. Behind him, a few vendors had paused their setups to watch, their faces blank or disinterested. Calvin stood still for a long moment, the paper heavy against his chest. He thought of every early morning he had spent harvesting crops, every long afternoon bent under the sun, every evening carefully loading his truck with the best produce he could grow. He thought of the pride he had felt when he first joined the market, believing in its promises of fairness and opportunity. All of it had been rendered meaningless by a handful of signatures on a piece of paper, by whispered lies, by cowardice disguised as procedure. "You are making a mistake," Calvin said calmly. "History will remember it." The tall man scoffed and said, "Maybe you should find another market. Maybe one that's more accommodating." His voice lingered on the last word, heavy with unspoken meaning. Calvin said nothing more. He turned and walked back to his truck, feeling the weight of every stare on his back. He climbed into the cab, shut the door with a soft thud, and sat for a moment in the silence, letting the finality of the moment settle over him like dust. As he pulled out of the lot, he glanced once in the rear-view mirror. The market shrank behind him, colorful and lively and utterly unchanged, as if he had never been there at all. But Calvin knew better. He knew that injustice left marks even if they were invisible to those who benefited from it. It left scars not just on the body, but on the soul of a community. It festered and rotted the foundations until someday, somewhere, it all came crashing down. He drove without any clear destination, letting the country roads unfold before him. The fields stretched wide and golden on either side, the sun high and unrelenting. At a small gas station outside town, he stopped to fill up. As he pumped gas, he overheard two men talking nearby, their voices low but urgent. "Did you hear?" one said. "That old black farmer got kicked out for causing trouble." "About time," the other replied. "You let them in, they just stir the pot." Calvin kept his back to them, his face a mask of calm, but inside him something shifted. It was not anger that stirred. It was a cold, clear sense of readiness. They wanted him gone, erased, forgotten. They would soon learn how impossible that would be. When he returned home that afternoon, he went straight to the small study where he kept his important papers. The bold headline read "Local vendor with criminal past causes chaos at farmer's market," accompanied by a blurry photo of Calvin standing by his booth, his face caught mid-expression, twisted into something almost unrecognizable. Calvin read the article twice, hardly believing the lies spilling from the page. The story painted him as a dangerous man with a history of violence and disorder, claiming that he had been arrested multiple times for charges that had no basis in reality. There was no fact-checking, no evidence, just anonymous sources and inflammatory quotes designed to turn public opinion decisively against him. Calvin set the paper down carefully, his hands steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "So this is the next step," he murmured. "When they cannot silence you, they destroy your name." He had seen it before countless times, throughout history and in his own life. Reputation, once stained, was nearly impossible to cleanse in the eyes of a fearful public. By mid-morning, the effects of the article were already visible. Social media feeds filled with angry comments calling him a threat. Anonymous messages flooded his farm's public email, some demanding he leave town, others laced with threats thinly veiled as advice. Even suppliers he had worked with for years suddenly went silent. A few returned his calls with brief, awkward conversations, explaining that due to recent developments, they would have to reconsider future business. Calvin understood the unspoken meaning behind their words. Fear was a powerful weapon, and the market leadership had wielded it expertly. The worst blow, however, came later that afternoon when Calvin visited a nearby roadside stand where he had long partnered with another vendor, an elderly man named Hank Miller, who sold wildflower honey harvested from his own beehives. Hank had always treated Calvin with kindness, offering advice and shared laughs when business was slow. Calvin parked his truck and approached Hank's stand with a heavy heart, unsure what reception he would find. Hank looked up as Calvin approached, and for a moment, there was a flicker of the old warmth in his eyes. But then he quickly glanced around, lowered his voice, and said, "Calvin, you shouldn't be here." Calvin nodded slowly, already knowing the truth but needing to hear it. "They came by yesterday," Hank said, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. Said if I keep doing business with you, I'll lose my spot here. They're serious, son. I'm sorry. Calvin placed a hand gently on the table between them, steady and understanding. I don't blame you, he said. They're playing a dirty game. I don't want you to suffer because of me. Hank's face tightened with regret. It's not right, he said. Everyone knows what they're doing, but folks are scared. You know how it is. Calvin gave a small nod. He did know. He had known all his life. Take care of yourself, Hank, Calvin said. Keep your head high. Hank hesitated, then extended his hand. Calvin shook it firmly, feeling the strength still left in the old man's grip despite the sadness behind his eyes. As Calvin walked back to his truck, he could feel the eyes following him again, filled with a mix of fear, suspicion, and something worse, resignation. The townspeople had accepted the narrative fed to them because it was easier than questioning it, easier than standing up, easier than risking anything. Calvin drove away, the landscape blurring past him, but his mind remained razor-sharp. They had taken everything they could from him in the public eye. His reputation, his place at the market, even the friendships he had built. They thought they had stripped him of all his defenses. What they had done, without realizing it, was remove the last illusions Calvin might have had about playing by their rules. There would be no more bending, no more appealing to their better nature. The organic produce company, now valued at over $1.5 billion, had grown from his modest farm roots into a national supplier stocked in every major chain across the country. Most in Milltown thought of him as just another aging black farmer with dirt under his fingernails and little else. They had no idea they had been mocking the founder of the very brand that filled their grocery stores. Calvin picked up his phone and called a number he knew by heart. On the second ring, a sharp voice answered. Mr. Brooks, the woman said warmly, we've been expecting your call. Calvin laid out the situation with cool precision, detailing every act of discrimination, defamation, and assault he had endured over the past weeks. He spoke without embellishment, allowing the facts alone to lay bare the ugliness he had faced. By the time he finished, the woman on the other end said, we'll take care of it. Full withdrawal. Immediate effect. Calvin ended the call and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The wheels had been set in motion. By morning, the ripples would become waves. Across the country, emails shot out from the headquarters of Brooks Naturals, informing every retailer, distributor, and partner that effective immediately, all supply contracts with any business located within Milltown or affiliated markets were terminated. Every shipment en route was rerouted or recalled. Every pending order was canceled. Within hours, shelves once stocked with Brooks Naturals premium organic goods stood empty. Customers complained. Managers panicked. Regional supervisors scrambled to find replacements, but nothing matched the trust and demand built over years. Local store owners who had once ignored or mocked Calvin's presence now found themselves fielding angry calls from corporate offices demanding explanations. Calvin watched the chaos unfold with a steady gaze. He received updates from his legal team throughout the morning. By noon, news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines flashed across social media. Major organic brand cuts ties with Milltown amid discrimination allegations. The town that had so smugly cast him out now found itself thrust into the national spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Reporters flooded Milltown, their cameras capturing the empty shelves, the confused shoppers, the defensive market managers refusing to comment. Sandra Myers, who had once dismissed Calvin with a tilt of her chin, now faced mounting pressure as corporate partners began questioning not just the farmers market, but every event, festival, and program the town sponsored. Calvin knew this was only the beginning. They wanted me small, he said aloud to no one, but they forgot I already learned how to grow beyond their walls. Calls came in from advocacy groups, from major investors, even from government offices wanting statements or offering support. Calvin chose his words carefully, making it clear that his actions were not about revenge, but about accountability. Discrimination cannot hide behind tradition, he said in an official press release. Silence is not neutrality. It is complicity, and complicity carries consequences. That evening, Calvin sat on his porch once more, watching the sunset spill gold and crimson across the horizon. He felt no gloating satisfaction, only a profound sense of balance restoring itself. They had tried to erase him from their small world, never imagining that he held the power to impact a much larger one. They had misjudged him not because he was weak, but because they had been blinded by their own arrogance. His face was calm, composed, but his eyes carried the weight of history, of ancestors who had dreamed of a day like this but had never lived to see it. At exactly 10 a.m., Calvin stepped onto the stage of a national press conference held in the nearest major city, his presence commanding without a word. Cameras flashed, journalists leaned forward, and television networks broadcast the image of the simple farmer-turned-corporate titan to millions across the country. Calvin approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and took a breath that was neither hurried nor hesitant. He spoke in a voice clear, deep, and deliberate. "My name is Calvin Brooks," he began. "I am the founder and CEO of Brooks Naturals, a company built not on privilege, but on perseverance, integrity, and respect for the land and its people." The room was silent, hanging on to every word. Calvin continued, recounting in measured detail the discrimination, the public humiliation, the false accusations, and the systemic barriers he had faced at the Milltown Farmers Market. He spoke not with anger, but with the steady conviction of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to stand for. "Let me be clear," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words settle. "Our decision to terminate all contracts, sponsorships, and future investments in Milltown is not made lightly. It is made in the unwavering belief that silence in the face of injustice is itself an act of injustice." The reporters scribbled furiously. Microphones leaned closer. Calvin outlined the financial impact of Brooks Naturals' departure on the local economy, citing numbers that made even the most cynical executives flinch. He named the partnerships being dissolved, the grants and programs being revoked, the job opportunities evaporating in real time because of one community's refusal to uphold basic human dignity. "Economic prosperity," Calvin said, "cannot thrive where hatred festers unchecked." Then he dropped the final blow. He revealed that his company had been quietly funding several agricultural scholarships, infrastructure grants, and small business initiatives across the region, many of which Milltown had directly benefited from without ever knowing their benefactor was the very man they had tried to destroy. "That support," Calvin said evenly, "is ending today." The silence in the room thickened, heavy with the realization that the story was no longer about a small-town market dispute. It was about something larger, something systemic, something shameful that could no longer be ignored. By evening, the story had gone viral. Major news outlets ran exposés on the history of exclusion at the Milltown Farmers Market, uncovering a pattern of quietly buried complaints, uninvestigated incidents, and discriminatory practices that stretched back decades. Former vendors, emboldened by Calvin's bravery, stepped forward with their own stories of mistreatment. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the town's leadership. Public figures and politicians weighed in, some offering support, others scrambling to distance themselves. In Milltown itself, shockwaves rippled through every layer of society. Shopkeepers who had once laughed at Calvin's misfortunes now faced angry customers demanding accountability. Parents questioned the lessons their children were learning from a town that had so casually destroyed an honest man's reputation. At the farmers market, Sandra Myers convened an emergency meeting, her face pale and drawn as she read through the avalanche of bad press and legal notices flooding her inbox. Vendors argued loudly among themselves, some furious at the leadership for letting the situation spiral, others terrified of what more revelations might come. "We have to issue a statement," one man barked. "A real one apologizing." Another snapped, "Apologizing won't fix this. The sponsors are pulling out. Half our vendors are threatening lawsuits." Sandra tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "We can ride this out," she said. "We just need to stay united." A board member glared at her and tossed a packet of papers onto the table. It was a termination letter, signed by a majority vote she had not even been allowed to contest. "You're done, Sandra," he said flatly. "Effective immediately." She opened her mouth to protest, but the cold looks around the room told her it was futile. They needed a scapegoat, and she had volunteered for the role the moment she turned a blind eye to Calvin Brooks' persecution. Within hours, the news spread. Sandra Myers was out, facing not only public disgrace, but also a massive civil lawsuit filed by Calvin's legal team for violations of his civil rights, loss of income, and defamation. The lawsuit demanded millions in damages, a figure that sent a fresh wave of panic through the market's leadership and the town's insurance providers. Meanwhile, Rick Donovan faced his own reckoning. A letter from the state's Department of Commerce arrived at his front door that morning, informing him that his vendor license had been permanently revoked. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning years, hidden only by the complicity of market officials who had chosen silence over justice. Rick, once the loudest and most arrogant voice at the market, now found his booth shuttered, his reputation shattered. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. His regular customers vanished overnight. "You brought this on yourself," one neighbor muttered as Rick tried to explain at a town hall meeting. "Nobody forced you to be a bully." Bethany Cross received a similar notice, delivered with the impersonal efficiency of official justice. Her assault on Calvin had been captured in a second video, one previously suppressed, but now released by an anonymous source who could no longer stomach the lies. The footage showed her shoving Calvin unprovoked, then manipulating the situation to her advantage. Her employer, under intense pressure, fired her immediately. With no license and no prospects, Bethany found herself isolated, jobless, and branded with a stain that would follow her for years to come. The market itself, once the pride of Milltown, now resembled a ghost town. Rows of empty booths stood as silent testimony to the greed, prejudice, and cowardice that had poisoned the soil of their community. Tourism plummeted. Local businesses suffered. Those who had once whispered and looked away now paid a price they could not have imagined. As the dust settled, Calvin Brooks watched from a distance. He had not sought their ruin. He had sought accountability, and the town's own actions had authored their downfall. In an interview with a national network, Calvin was asked if he felt vindicated. He paused, considering the weight of the question, then said simply, "Justice is not about feeling good. It's about setting things right for those who come after you." His words echoed across the country, inspiring debates, policies, and new initiatives aimed at rooting out systemic discrimination in local markets and small-town governance. A full year had passed since the storm that had reshaped Milltown forever. Seasons changed, crops grew and withered, businesses opened and closed, but the memory of what had happened remained etched into the very fabric of the town. Some had left, unable to bear the stain of their complicity. Others stayed and tried haltingly to rebuild what they had lost, knowing it could never truly be as it once was. In the quietness of late autumn, when the air carried the scent of turning leaves and distant wood smoke, Calvin Brooks received an unexpected envelope in the mail. The handwriting on the front was careful, almost hesitant. Inside, he found a letter from Sandra Myers. It was handwritten, no formal letterhead, no rehearsed corporate language, just plain words, trembling slightly in their honesty. "Mr. Brooks," it began, "I am writing not out of obligation, but out of genuine regret. I see now what I refused to see then. I see the harm I caused, the cowardice I chose, and the humanity I denied. I am sorry. I do not expect forgiveness, but I would like to learn how to be better. I want to help heal what I helped break. If you are willing, I would be honored to learn from you." Calvin sat with the letter for a long time, weighing it in his hands as if it held the past and the future both. He thought of the days when Sandra would not even meet his eyes, when her silence had shouted louder than words. He thought of the faces in the crowd, how easily they had accepted his humiliation because it cost them nothing. Yet he also thought of the small changes that had begun to sprout since then, cautious but real. Milltown had started programs to support minority-owned businesses. A new market board, diverse and transparent, had been elected. Scholarships bearing Calvin's name had helped young farmers of color find their footing. Change was never clean. It was messy, painful, imperfect. But it was change nonetheless. Calvin picked up a pen and began to write back. His letter was brief but clear. "Ms. Myers," he wrote, "I appreciate your words. Growth begins with truth. If you are sincere, there is a path forward, but it will require more than words. It will require action, consistency, humility. I am willing to meet with you, but under one condition. Every current and future vendor of Milltown Farmers Market must complete mandatory training on justice, equity, and human dignity. I will design the program. I will fund it, and I will expect it to be honored not as a punishment, but as a promise." A week later, Sandra responded, agreeing without hesitation. Calvin spent months building the training curriculum, drawing on voices from civil rights leaders, farmers of all backgrounds, educators, and historians. He made sure it was thorough, uncomfortable where it needed to be, hopeful where it could be. In the spring, the training launched in the old community center at the edge of town. Calvin stood at the front of the room on the first day, facing a crowd of vendors who sat quietly, some wary, some genuinely eager, all knowing the world had shifted beneath their feet. He opened the session without bitterness. "We are not here to shame the past," he said. "We are here to shape the future." For 8 weeks, Calvin led discussions, workshops, and projects that challenged old assumptions and built new understandings. Some participants dropped out. Most stayed. A few, like Hank Miller, the honey vendor, became some of the program's fiercest advocates. On the final day, Sandra Myers stood up before the group, her voice unsteady as she spoke. "We failed," she said. "We failed ourselves, our neighbors, our community. But we are here now, and we will not fail again." Calvin watched her and felt no triumph, only a steady, quiet satisfaction. Healing had begun. Later that year, at the town's annual Harvest Festival, Calvin was invited to speak. This time, there were no sneers, no turned backs, no whispered judgments. As he stepped onto the small wooden stage, the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Calvin smiled slightly, lifting a hand in acknowledgement. He spoke not of revenge, nor even of justice alone, but of resilience, of reconciliation, of the stubborn, beautiful hope that grew from the hardest soil. "It is not enough to remove injustice," he said. "We must plant justice in its place and tend it with care, or it will not survive." As the applause rose again, Calvin Brooks looked out over Milltown and saw not the broken town that had tried to crush him, but a community struggling, striving, stumbling towards something better. It would take time. It would take work. But it would be worth it. The end. If this story moved you or made you think differently, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. I would love to hear your thoughts. What part of Calvin's journey surprised you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I read every one of them.